How big a moment is this?
It is huge. We can't underestimate the importance of this moment. It's not only that the ceasefire is holding, the war is over. And President Trump made that very clear. The agreement is signed by Israel and Hamas, made it very clear. There are mechanisms that are being put into place to ensure that the ceasefire will hold, including a Security Council resolution, the deployment of a multinational force, the creation of a new temporary Palestinian government and a Palestinian security force, an international envelope that we don't really understand what it will be, that Trump called the Peace Board, that he will be heading. It was a very big development.
In the speech that he made at the Knesset yesterday, President Trump began by talking of what he called a historic dawn of a new Middle East. Do you believe that dawn is now becoming clear and visible?
I think it is. I think that the Middle East today is very different than the Middle East that Shimon Peres talked about as a new Middle East back in the 1990s. The reality of the Middle East has changed dramatically, both as a result of the last 2 years. Hezbollah is no longer the determining factor in Lebanon anymore. The government of Lebanon is working on its own plan of decommissioning Hezbollah's arms and power. Syria is no longer the Syria of Bashar al-Assad. This is one of the things that the Americans told me to tell Hamas. They said, look at what we're doing with Syria. We removed all of the sanctions on Syria. We welcome Ahmed Ashara to Washington. We've invited the international community to invest in Syria. We can do the same thing with Palestine if there's cooperation and willingness to live in peace. The role I played was basically opening up a channel to Mr. Witkoff and being able to communicate with him in a two-way communication so that I understood what the Americans were trying to achieve. I could help in preparing the proposals that were being submitted by the Americans to the Qatari Prime Minister, to the Hamas delegation. I could emphasize the messages that the United States wanted to send to Hamas, primarily that President Trump wanted to end the war and that the Americans would provide Hamas with all the guarantees that they needed in order to agree to release the hostages up front and know that Israel would not attack again.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Yesterday was a huge day for Israel, Palestine, and very possibly West Asia as a whole. All the living hostages have been released, and nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners and detainees have also been freed. The ceasefire is holding, and aid is now flowing into Gaza. And to cap it all, President Trump paid a fine visit to Israel and Egypt. He addressed the Knesset and participated in the Gaza Peace Summit at Sharm el-Sheikh. Joining me now to talk about all of this is the Middle East Director of the International Communities Organization, and the negotiator who secured the release of Gilad Shalit in 2011, Gershon Baskin. Dr. Baskin, can you start by explaining to an Indian audience how big a moment yesterday was, both for the people of Israel and the people of Palestine? Not only have all the living hostages been released, but nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners and detainees have also been freed. The ceasefire is holding and aid is now flowing into Gaza. How big a moment is this?
It is huge. We can't underestimate the importance of this moment. It's not only that the ceasefire is holding, the war is over. And President Trump made that very clear. The agreement is signed by Israel and Hamas, made it very clear. There are mechanisms that are being put into place to ensure that the ceasefire will hold, including a Security Council resolution, the deployment of a multinational force, the creation of a new temporary Palestinian government and a Palestinian security force, an international envelope that we don't really understand what it will be, that Trump called the Peace Board, that he will be heading. It was a very big development. It does not put an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We don't have the broader peace, the expansion of the Abraham Accords, as President Trump talked about. That is further down the road, but stopping the war was the most important thing that needed to be done. With all that you said, bringing home the hostages, freeing Palestinian prisoners, the entrance of humanitarian aid into Gaza, there's still a lot of very critical work to be done, including the importance of Hamas returning another 24 deceased hostages who are buried somewhere in Gaza. They returned only 4 of the deceased hostages yesterday.
Let me ask you, how difficult were the negotiations to secure the hostage release? The BBC's Gaza correspondent, Rushdie Abu Alouf, has reported that in the early hours of yesterday, literally just a couple of hours before the hostages were due to be released, Islamic Jihad was reluctant to release them because it wanted important Palestinian prisoners like Marwan Barghouti and Ahmed Sadat to be released by Israel. Was that a real stumbling block at the last moment?
It was a glitch. It was a problem. It was not something that was going to break down the deal. The negotiations were not that difficult the moment that Donald Trump decided that the war had to end. For more than a year, there have been proposals on the table to do what happened just a few days ago. But the problem was that the government of Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu refused to end the war. They were convinced, and they had convinced the Americans, that the Israeli mighty military pressure on Hamas and on the Gaza people would bring Hamas to its knees, that Hamas would surrender and raise a white flag. And despite the fact that people like me were telling them for months that Hamas will never surrender, Hamas will fight to the very last Gazan, but they will not surrender, was not absorbed, was not understood by the Americans, because their experience is, we can force them to surrender. But after the failed assassination attempt by Israel of the Hamas leadership in Qatar, in Doha, President Trump had a problem with the Gulf Arab states that he's very close to and sees vital U.S. interest, perhaps personal interest there as well. And he made a decision that the war had to end at that point.
Now, I know, Dr. Baskin, that you had an important role negotiating not just the hostage release and the prisoner release, but the wider peace deal as well. Why don't you, to the extent you can, tell us about the role you played?
The role I played was basically opening up a channel to Mr. Witkoff and being able to communicate with him in a two-way communication so that I understood what the Americans were trying to achieve. I could help in preparing the proposals that were being submitted by the Americans to the Qatari Prime Minister, to the Hamas delegation. I could emphasize the messages that the United States wanted to send to Hamas, primarily that President Trump wanted to end end the war, and that the Americans would provide Hamas with all the guarantees that they needed in order to agree to release the hostages up front and know that Israel would not attack again. My two-way communication with Witkoff began about 2 months ago. It was very intensive over the last month. I, on Saturday night, met Jared Kushner as well, who told me that all of the messages that I had been exchanging with Mr. Witkoff were shared with him as well, so that there was also direct involvement of Jared Kushner in the process that I didn't know about, but it was taking place. But I want to emphasize the credit for this goes to President Trump and goes to Witkoff and to Jared Kushner. It goes to the other mediators, the Qataris, the Egyptians, and of course, the Turkish intelligence chief. They're the ones who are on the ground dealing with the issues on a daily basis, making this agreement happen.
Now, in the speech that he gave to the Knesset yesterday afternoon, President Trump went out of his way several times to accept the importance of Steve Witkoff. You were directly in touch with the critical man himself. That is a very key role you played.
Yes, it was a key role, and it happened because my Palestinian partner, Samerson Jalawi, in December noticed that Mr. Witkoff was going to be a keynote speaker at a Bitcoin conference in Abu Dhabi. This was a month before he went into the White House, but his appointment as the Middle East envoy had already been announced, and Samer suggested that we fly to Abu Dhabi, register for the Bitcoin conference, and try to meet him there. And that's exactly what we did. We noticed he got up from his seat. We followed him to the men's room, and we caught him as he was coming out of the men's room. We introduced ourselves, exchanged business cards, gave him a copy of an article that Samer and I had written together and was published in a newspaper. And from that moment on, I began, which was mostly a one-way communication of sending information to him, messages from Hamas, in my own analysis of the situation. He would often acknowledge them, sometimes by writing, he agrees, or that's a good idea, sometimes with an emoji. But about 2 months ago, the communication became two ways. And we started talking regularly, both on WhatsApp and by telephone. And I must say, I've been doing this work for decades. I've never been so close to the most powerful man in the world. And let's face it, Trump is the most powerful man in the world. Witkoff described himself to me as being probably number 4 in the US administration. Although he's not an elected official, he is certainly one of the closest people to President Trump. And he would, at times, come out of the Oval Office and call me. Or we had a communication when he was sitting next to President Trump at the tennis match that they were both watching. And Witkoff was on his phone communicating with me as he was sitting next to President Trump. So it became quite an important mechanism or channel for me to communicate what I believe needs to be done. He didn't always agree with me. We had arguments, we had differences of opinion, but it was the biggest opportunity I've had in my life to help to shape the policy that would be so consequential for the state of Israel and for the Palestinian people.
And through Steve Witkoff, did you also manage to get contact with the Hamas people directly? Did you also manage to get contact with Qatar and Egypt?
Yes, I've been in communication with 8 people in the Hamas leadership throughout the war, except for a short period after the 3rd week of the war, I think, when I cut off my ties with them because of what they had done. But then I renewed those contacts. There were 3 people in the Hamas leadership who communicated with me regularly, even though I sent messages constantly to 8 members of the leadership, all outside of Gaza, no one in Gaza. I've been in touch with the Hamas intelligence for 20 years. And of course, during this last period, those contacts were much more intense. In October of last year, I was invited to visit Qatar, and I have maintained contact with the Qatari intelligence service since my visit in Qatar and throughout this period as well, and regular communication with the Qatari intelligence.
Against the background of your involvement, let me ask you, has Israel made a mistake by refusing to release Marwan Barghouti? The Palestinians consider him their Nelson Mandela, And I know that you in the past have written in support of his release. So did Israel make a mistake refusing to release him?
I believe so. About 2 weeks ago, I sent to Mr. Witkoff my understanding of Marwan Barghouti, who I know since 1996. During the years of the Oslo peace process, I had organized meetings between Marwan Barghouti and the leadership of the Fatah movement with the members of the Israeli governing coalition of Netanyahu at the time, from the Likud party and from other right-wing parties. We spent more than 200 hours together in discussions. About a year and a half before this war began on October 7, 2023, I managed to convince one of the former heads of the Israeli Shin Bet to carry on a correspondence with Marwan Barghouti. They exchanged letters 5 times. In Marwan Barghouti's last letter before the war, it was a 4-page letter in which he detailed how he envisioned the implementation of a 2-state solution, the creation of the state of Palestine next to Israel, living in peace with Israel, framed in a regional framework of security and economic development. I shared that letter with Mr. Witkoff as well. Witkoff wrote back to me saying, okay, I know what you think. What do you think mainstream Israelis think about it? And I solicited the opinion from about 25 mainstream Israelis, including former generals, former heads of the Mossad, former heads of the Shin Bet, a former prime minister, other important, a president of an Israeli university. Not everyone agreed with me. Not everyone thought that Marwan Barghouti should be released. I shared all of that with Witkoff. The majority thought that Marwan should be released. Some of the people said that if Marwan could be a unifying force in support of peace, then yes. If not, then no. But the majority of those Israelis that I solicited their opinion said yes. I believe that the American position to Israel was to include Marwan Barghouti on the list. But my impression is that the Americans would not go to war with Israel over the issue as well.
Now, President Trump, as you know, has not just once, but multiple times claimed credit for the entire peace deal, the hostage release, the prisoners release, and the wider details that are attached to it. Most people grant him that credit. But tell me, from someone who's viewed this from the inside, just how central, just how key was President Trump?
100% credit goes to President Trump. You know that in September of 2024, I got the agreement of Hamas for more or less the same deal. But at that time, I was told by the Israeli negotiators that Israel refuses to end the war. The prime minister refuses to end the war. Without Trump telling Benjamin Netanyahu in the Oval Office, where he was humiliated in front of the entire world when Trump handed him a telephone and dictated to Netanyahu to call the prime minister of Qatar and apologize for the Israeli attack against Hamas on Qatari soil. And Trump scripted exactly what Netanyahu had to say. When the journalist and the cameras left the Oval Office, Netanyahu told Netanyahu, the war is over. You're going to get all of your hostages, but you're going to announce that the war is over, and you're going to say that you accept this agreement. And that's what happened. And Trump made that discussion into reality when he posted it on Truth Social. This is the new way of diplomacy in the world today. You create the reality through social media. And then he basically did the same thing with Hamas. He wrote his 21 points, or Witkoff wrote the 21 points. Trump got the acceptance of the leadership of the Arab world in important Muslim states, and then gave it to Hamas and put a deadline on Hamas's response. Hamas said yes, but Trump took the yes and put it into social media, in his Truth Social, and turned the yes, but into yes. And then he brought in the head of Turkish intelligence with the assistance of Trump's good friend, Mr. Erdogan, and locked Hamas into the yes. And then brought them together in Sharm el-Sheikh. And in Sharm el-Sheikh, something unprecedented happened. The Israeli delegation and the Hamas delegation were sitting in the same room, across from each other, at the same table. That has never happened before. And that's solely because President Trump made this happen, and no one could say no to him.
You said very important things that are in that answer, both about the way Trump handled Prime Minister Netanyahu, but also the way Trump handled Hamas. I want to pick up on both of those. Let's start with Netanyahu. As you pointed out and hinted in that answer, a very similar deal was available several months ago, but
A
Prime
year
Minister
before.
Netanyahu simply refused to accept it. Does that mean that for several months now, Netanyahu has been holding up a peace deal?
Look, we know that Netanyahu was told by Trump in December of 2024 that President Trump wants a ceasefire before he enters the Oval Office. On January 19th, the ceasefire went into effect, a 60-day ceasefire. The sides had agreed that by day 15 of the ceasefire, they would begin talks on making the ceasefire permanent. Those talks were supposed to be concluded by the 30th day of the ceasefire of the 60 days. Those talks never began. They never happened. And after 60 days, when the ceasefire ended, a week later, Israel renewed the war, and President Trump did not say to Netanyahu, end the war, you're breaching the ceasefire, I want this war over. Instead, what happened is that there was a Netanyahu visit to the Oval Office, at which time Netanyahu convinced Trump that Israel could make Hamas surrender. And Trump bought that. So the war didn't end at that point. But the breaking point was, as I said, the Israeli attack in Doha, which whether Trump gave a green light for or not is not relevant today because Israel failed. We know that Trump hates failure. We also know, I think we can say with a pretty high level of certainty that if, God forbid, Israel had succeeded in killing the Hamas leadership in that attack in Doha, that we would not have gotten the hostages returned. The response of Hamas in Gaza would have been to execute all the hostages. I think we can be pretty certain of that. But that didn't happen. But what happened was, because no one believed in the region that Hamas didn't greenlight the Israeli attack, Trump had a problem with the Qataris, with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, with everyone in the region. And Trump has interest in the region. And the economic, financial interest of the United States of America and of the Trump family are much stronger in the Arab Gulf than they are in the state of Israel. And he had to fix that. And he fixed that by making sure that the war would end.
So the turning point for President Trump was Israel's failed attack on Qatar, which infuriated Trump. And as you said, he decided to fix that by turning the screws on Netanyahu. What do you think he would have said to Netanyahu? How hard would he have pushed?
He didn't have to push very hard because Netanyahu is completely dependent on Trump. There was no way that Netanyahu could say no to Trump. And let's face it, look at the way that the entire world relates to President Trump. As opposed to President Biden or perhaps even other American presidents who projected American weakness, Trump projects American power. And it is the projection of that American power that leaders of the entire world are afraid of and bow down to Trump. They know that Trump wants to be complimented. They know that Trump wants to hear that he's the greatest president in the history of the United States of America. I don't know if you saw this, or if the viewers of the show saw this, but last week there was a meeting in the Oval Office between the Prime Minister of Finland and President Trump. It was a love fest. It was the Prime Minister of Finland embracing Trump and complimenting him and telling him how wonderful it was. And of course, Trump responded in turn by telling the Finnish Prime Minister what a great guy he is and what a wonderful country Finland is.
Was it not the Finnish president?
I think it was the Finnish Prime Minister, maybe the president. I think it was the Prime Minister.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. It was a Finnish leader. And I think that's the way that the entire leadership of the world, perhaps with the exception of Putin and Xi right now, relate to President Trump.
Let's come to the pressure Trump put on Hamas. How critical was the role of Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey? Did they translate the message from Trump into terms that Hamas simply couldn't refuse?
Yes. But the key here at the end of the day were the Turks. The Qataris and the Egyptians have been doing this for a long time, and they applied pressure to Hamas, but there's a limit because Hamas learned how to work with them and understand the underlying messages. The screws really came down on them when the Turkish intelligence chief was brought in by President Erdogan after a conversation between Trump and Erdogan. And Turks have a lot of leverage over Hamas because there are a large number of Hamas people residing in Turkey today, much more than in Doha or in Cairo. And the Turks ideologically are based in alignment with Hamas to a large extent. And Trump asked Erdogan to make sure that the deal gets done. And because of their close relationship, President Erdogan made sure that it got done.
Tell me about the position of right-wing cabinet members like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. They haven't hesitated to express their opposition to the peace deal, but they've taken no steps at all so far to bring the government down. Does that mean that the Netanyahu government is safe for the time being?
Yes, it means that the government is safe for the time being. And this, again, is unprecedented, I think, in democratic countries where crucial members of the government vote against the government's party on a substantive issue. This is not some budget issue. This is substance of things that these two political parties have expressed a do or die policy. And they voted against the deal and stayed in the government. And I can't think of anything more cynical in the world of politics than the behavior of these two gentlemen and their political parties.
Let me raise another concern with you. Is there a danger that now that the hostages are released, Israel might resume the war? Hamas, as we know from the images that were available on television both last night and again this morning, is by no means finished. And we also know that Netanyahu has sworn to do the job the hard way if necessary. Will he pursue that hard way now? Or
No, he
do you
cannot.
accept what Trump said when
He
Mike
cannot.
Carney was visiting, that America will use its power to ensure that everyone adheres to the deal?
He cannot breach the deal. Not at this point, certainly not. There was talks yesterday when Hamas only returned 4 of the 28 deceased hostages that Israelis, including the Ministry of Defense and the Army, were calling it a breach of the deal. I communicated with Witkoff last night that there's a danger of this breaking down early because Israel is calling this a breach and threatening to resume the war. Witkoff responded to me saying, I will cut this short right now. The Americans will not let that happen. And soon, after there's a Security Council resolution, hopefully, there will be the deployment of the multinational force in Gaza made up of Arab countries and European countries and perhaps others. And that will be the best guarantee that Israel cannot resume the war and that Hamas cannot attack Israel. There will be a physical buffer of a multinational force in Gaza, which will serve the purpose of providing the guarantees that Hamas wanted and demanded, because Hamas was afraid that if they released the hostages, Israel would renew the war. If there are no substantive breaches by Hamas, then the United States will not allow Israel to renew the war.
The United States will not allow Israel to renew the war. You're putting it as strongly, as firmly as that. And when you say the United States, you mean Donald Trump will step in and ensure Netanyahu cannot renew the war?
100%.
In which case, let me ask you this. Phase 1 has clearly been successfully completed. Do you see phase 2 of the deal happening? Will Hamas disarm? They seem to be very reluctant to do so. Will Israel completely vacate the Gaza Strip? It's equally reluctant to do so. In fact, the map put out by Trump shows that at the end of the day, 15% of Gaza remains a security perimeter within Israeli hands. And finally, will there be a Palestinian state in the foreseeable future? The peace deal is extremely vague and uncertain about that.
Yeah, let's start with the issues of phase 2 of the deal. Many of these issues are on the table, have been negotiated, and solutions have been proposed. As I said, there will be a new Palestinian government. I'm not exactly sure how it would be formed, but I think that the President Abbas yesterday in Sharm el-Sheikh was an important indication that whatever Palestinian government will be established, it will have some connection to the Palestinian Authority that provides it with legitimacy internationally, because the Palestinian Authority, although enjoying very little legitimacy from the Palestinian people, is the legitimate international address for the Palestinian governance right now. There are a lot of names that have been proposed through the Egyptians, through Samer Sinjalawi, my partner, and I, who have been engaging with civil society and private sector leaders in Gaza over the last several weeks with several Zooms, meetings that we had with them, and they drafted 2 letters that we sent to President Trump saying that they are willing to take part in the new government. There are other people who have done the same. There will be a multinational force, and one of the things that happened on the sidelines of the meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh was Trump getting the commitments from these other countries, not only to provide finances for the reconstruction of Gaza, but also troops to put on the ground in Gaza. That will also happen. It needs to have this envelope of international legitimacy through a Security Council decision. There will be some form of disarming Hamas, but I want to put an asterisk along the side. Hamas is not a military threat to Israel anymore, and the amount of weapons that Hamas have is very limited. The lethal weapons that can attack Israel will be dealt with. Hamas has agreed to freezing the weapons, whatever that means. That's not defined. The United States is not demanding at this point that every Hamas person who has a gun has to turn it over. They certainly won't turn over their weapons to Israel. Once there is a multinational force and there is a Palestinian security force being supported by the multinational force, there will be a mechanism for decommissioning weapons from Hamas. It's a process that will take more time, but it will happen. And with regard to withdrawal from Gaza, I believe, and this has been discussed, that Israel will be forced to withdraw entirely from Gaza. But there needs to be a new Palestinian government. There needs to be the multinational force. There needs to be a Palestinian security force, and those things need to be effective and working. What was discussed and Hamas agreed to was that the security perimeter around the Gaza Strip on the Israeli border, which would be between 500 and 1,000 meters deep, would be a no-entry zone. But there wouldn't be any Israeli soldiers there. It would be a shoot-to-kill zone. If people enter that area, Israel would have the right to open up fire on them. But the idea is that this security perimeter, for as long as necessary, would be a no-entry zone on the Palestinian side of the Gaza Strip.
And there would be no Israeli soldiers in the zone.
That's what was talked about, that there would be no Israeli soldiers left in that zone.
And will there eventually, at some time in the future, be a Palestinian state?
That's a much bigger question. My answer is yes, definitely, because there's no other choice, but it won't happen with the current government of Israel, and the Hamas and the Palestinian people need to go to elections and elect a government that voices the view of the Palestinian people who are ready to live in peace with Israel.
Finally, then, in the speech that he made at the Knesset yesterday, President Trump began by talking of what he called a historic dawn of a new Middle East. Do you believe that dawn is now becoming clear and visible?
I think it is. I think that the Middle East today is very different than the Middle East that Shimon Peres talked about as a new Middle East back in the 1990s. The reality of the Middle East has changed dramatically, both as a result of the last 2 years. Hezbollah is no longer the determining factor in Lebanon anymore. The government of Lebanon is working on its own plan of decommissioning Hezbollah's arms and power. Syria is no longer the Syria of Bashar al-Assad. This is one of the things that the Americans told me to tell Hamas. They said, look at what we're doing with Syria. We removed all of the sanctions on Syria. We welcomed Ahmed Ashara to Washington. We've invited the international community to invest in Syria. We can do the same thing with Palestine if there's cooperation and willingness to live in peace. Look at the changes that the Abraham Accords made. The educational system of the United Arab Emirates today is devoid of anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli sentiment. They are teaching multiculturalism and the acceptance of other religions. The Emiratis built this Abrahamic Faith Center in Abu Dhabi with a mosque, a church, and a synagogue in the same compound as a symbol of coexistence. There are kosher restaurants in Dubai today. More than 1.5 million Israelis have visited the Emirates. Bahrain is at peace with Israel. The Saudis have expressed their willingness to make full peace with Israel on the condition of there being a Palestinian state. Israel could be a welcome member of this region with enormous opportunities for the state of Israel and the Israeli people and the Israeli economy. So we have a very different reality than we've had in the past. And Trump knows it. He helped to shape this reality.
So you're suggesting or hinting that in the fullness of time, a Saudi-Israeli peace agreement is also possible?
When the Israelis will agree to accept a Palestinian state next to Israel on part of the land of Israel, Palestine, the Saudis will make full peace with Israel.
And Trump will ensure that Israel is forced to accept that somewhere in the not too distant future.
I hope so.
Dr. Baskin, thank you very much for the time you've given me, and in particular, thank you very much for sharing with us details of the critical role that you played within the negotiations that have now reached a certain completion. I'm deeply grateful for all that you've told me, particularly for the fact that you revealed this for the first time to an Indian audience on this program. Take care, stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.